So, for my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the subgenre of horror that I decided to focus on, which was horror remakes between 2003 to 2023. And moving on to the table of contents, in the presentation, I will address an overview of my chosen horror subgenre, a walkthrough of the film I watched for my second entry, an overview of my entry 3 director, my thoughts on the chosen horror subgenre, and any film recommendations I have for horror remakes. So, beginning with an overview of horror remakes from the 21st century. Just to give a little background to describe what a horror remake is. A horror remake is a new version of an existing horror film that offers a new perspective on the original film. Some of the most popular horror remakes of the 21st century include It. The original film was released in 1990 with Tim Curry as Pennywise and took place in the 60s. The 2017 remake took place in the 90s with Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise. Another example is Amity Horror, which came out in 2005. The original film was released in 1979. The 2005 remake uses actual ghosts instead of leaving it up to the imagination of audiences. Another example is Halloween, which came out in 2007. The original film was released in 1978 with its premise of a six-year-old killer becoming an adult serial killer, paving the way for other serial killer films. The remake focused on the sad and terrifying origin story of Michael Myers. And one last example is House of Wax, which came out in 2005. The original film was released in 1953 as a classic murder mystery, whereas the 2005 remake went for a slasher thriller approach that resembled the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And here are some reasons why horror film remakes are made. So, one, with the improvement of CGI, animation, and other technologies, we want to see if we can surpass the quality of a film that was made at a time when these technologies were not as good as today. 2. The film wants to take a once popular movie and appeal to a new generation of movie fans. And 3. As cliche and typical as it sounds, the film industry runs out of ideas. Sometimes it's easier to remake a classic horror film, but with modern effects. There are also general reasons why any genre of film might get a remake, and some of these reasons may include remakes decrease financial risk, remakes are expected to offer higher return rates than other movies while involving less risk, and remakes tell a familiar story, offering comfort to an audience that has seen the original. So horror remakes need to work diligently to be as or more successful than their predecessors. And some elements that can make a horror remake good include throwing in a new element that the original didn't have, being somewhat reliable to the source material, being relatable to a new audience, paying homage to the original film while maintaining its distinct differences as a remake, the directors offering a new perspective or their own personal twist to make it their own, and lastly, having a good production company that will create high quality effects that elevate the film from its predecessor. And moving on to a walkthrough of the second entry. So, for my second blog entry, I watched the movie It, which is directed by Andreas Muschietti, and it's a film remake of the 1990 horror miniseries directed by Tommy Wallace. The horror remake introduces a new interpretation of the characters, style, tone, and cinematography that differs from the original. Set in the 1980s, 7 young outcasts from small-town Derry, Maine band together to form the Losers Club to investigate what happened to Georgie Denbrough and face a shape-shifting monster called It that feeds on the fears of children and devours them. So It utilized various film techniques to create horror, and I'll give you one example of that, but let me just give some background information about this character so it makes a little bit more sense. Stanley is one of the main characters in the movie. He's part of the Losers Club, and he's one of the kids that is fighting against the monster, Pennywise, so that he won't hurt any more children. And just for context for this particular scene, he is Jewish and his father is a rabbi. So, while at church after school, Stanley takes the Torah to his father's office where he shields his eyes from a distorted painting on the wall that he's afraid of. Lighting is used to cast a shadow on Stanley and the painting to foreshadow that terror is coming, and it relates to this painting, which is in the darkness. And I also included a video of this scene so you can kind of get a better idea of what I'm referring to here. So let's compare the 2017 remake to the original 1990 miniseries, starting with The Losers Club. Compared to the miniseries, the acting of the main cast of kids in the 2017 remake feels more theatrical. And in the 1990 miniseries, the kids feel more like genuine people you would come across in your neighborhood. They felt a bit more realistic. In terms of It, or Pennywise, Bill Skarsgård captured the terror of It well as a devious living monster in the 2017 remake. His acting was more terrifying than the acting of Tim Curry in the 1990 miniseries, with gangly features and chaotic energy. The costume design of Pennywise also saw an improvement. And in terms of It in the 1990 version, Tim Curry's acting and costume design come together to create a more comical character. Whether this was intentional or not, the 2017 remake delivered a scarier Pennywise overall. In terms of style and tone, the 2017 remake feels like it switches from a supernatural horror with monsters to an 80s comedy with the cleaning montage. It's a horror movie that derails from what it's supposed to be at some points. Perhaps this was intentional as a modern remake to capture the intention of a wide demographic. And in terms of style and tone for the 1990 version, it's consistently dramatic. Moving on to cinematography, in the remake, it benefits from CGI that wasn't available in the 1990s. It was also a good creative choice to include Pennywise in the background of random scenes to increase scares. One example of this is when the librarian stalks behind Ben, another kid in the Losers Club, in the library. Furthermore, an effort is made to have consistently red balloons everywhere, which shows that it is everywhere and can't be escaped. The music and audio is much more scary in the remake, including children singing, laughing, and the creepy sound of musical boxes being winded up. And for the 1990 version, to its disadvantage, it had to rely more on practical monster design and claymation. And I also included a video here to better depict how different these, the remake and the original miniseries are. Moving on to an overview of Entry 3. So for Entry 3, I chose to focus on Italian filmmaker Luca Guadagnino for my third blog entry. I chose this director because of the success of his horror remake Suspiria and wanted to gather further information about the brilliance of Guadagnino and his approach to horror. So here's my impression of him. Of all the horror film directors I have come across over this summer course, I would say that Luca is the most romantic. The reviews I read make good points about how Guadagnino frequently emphasizes sensualism in his films. He dislikes contemporary horror for taking an approach that he would describe as strictly conservative. I never found myself scared or in fear during my watch of Suspiria. Instead, I found myself analyzing each carefully crafted, aesthetically pleasing scene where it seems every character is depicted as perfectly beautiful. Guadagnino has offered a unique, more mature perspective to horror in a genre that's filled with borderline childish humor, gore, and scares. I have also included a video where Guadagnino is being interviewed so you can kind of get a better idea of his character as I described here, and you'll see how he definitely has a more mature approach when it comes to films. And moving on to my thoughts on the subgenre of horror remakes. Horror remakes are hit or miss, all depending on several factors such as who is directing, production quality, level of creativity, whether the film has a sense of purpose, and more. Some horror remakes successfully reimagine and reinvent their predecessors for a new generation in an interesting, unique, and creative way. Others try to do so but completely flop. The film I watched for my fourth blog entry definitely flopped. Child's Play, which came out in 2019. A poor excuse for a remake of the 1988 classic, Child's Play 2019 failed to implement the original premise in a modern setting, where indecisive and whether to go on their own path or stick to the original, and displayed terrible CGI and special effects for a movie that came out in 2019. The bottom line is, horror remakes can be absolutely terrible if not executed correctly and marketed to the intended demographic. And here are some horror remake film recommendations. It, 2017, Suspiria, 2018, Willard, 2003, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 2014, Evil Dead, 2013, House of Wax, 2005, Friday the 13th, 2009. And lastly, these are just my references from every single blog entry. Thank you.